Measuring your success. How do you measure your success? I'll give you examples of how schools and businesses measure their success. Schools, i.e. high schools, colleges, universities, junior colleges, grade school, middle school, just about every academic institution you can think of, measures the students' success by giving them progress reports and report cards. And what those do, as you know, they give them a graded report, or they give a 1, 2, 3 report depending on what grade level they're in. They are measuring the effectiveness of their teachers by how the students respond in kind with their grades. So they kind of can do two things at once based on standardized tests that generally the government will give them at the end of the year. And though that's a different type of testing, but essentially they get progress reports, then report cards, and they have standardized testing. And the school measures its success and or effectiveness by putting themselves, or they're placed in a percentile of X amount of schools reach this percentage, your schools reach this percentage, and here's kind of where you stand and fall. That's how schools measure their success. How do athletic programs and or businesses measure their success? Businesses measure their success a lot of times by the bottom line, and that can be how much product did we sell, how many services did we sell, how much money did we make, what was the profit margin, and they in large part are measured by how much money they made, and the success of their business is determined by the results and outcomes of the products sold. Athletics, sport, how do you measure success in those realms? A large part of the success measurement is by results and outcomes, similar to business. Okay, but if you only go by results and outcome, where is the progress report to tell you where you are before the competition, event, tournament? That's a very good question. Just like schools do progress reports, most schools do progress reports. College not so much, although when we travel on trips, you know, the USOEC used to send out information to the teachers and the professors so that we understood where the students were. If they received, you know, where we wanted them to be on the grading scale, then they could go and compete. But that wasn't necessarily something they had to do, but they did it, you know, because they cared about the students. In high schools and middle schools and grade schools, they have, you know, let's say if they get 2 or 3 or 4 report cards per year. In between those report cards, or about a quarter or halfway through, they'll send out a progress report, and they'll have parent, teacher, student conferences, so you can actually figure out how your student's doing. They'll get a progress report, and then about 2 weeks later, you'll have, you know, a parent, teacher, student conference. I actually did those at the United States Olympic Education Center when we had high school athletes in the program, so I was able to gauge where they were academically by going to those parent, teacher, in that case I was the guardian, so that I could see where they were at. Plus they would get progress reports online, and then they would get a report card by the end of the semester. So using the academic setting, they can get a progress report, you know, probably every 5 to 6 weeks. So they're not just waiting on the end of the semester when they get the test. Sport, I think, can be the same way. And you're asking, well, why would you want to measure success any other way but the outcome? Isn't that the goal? Yes, but in sport there's also an educational component. I think you always, when you're dealing with young people or athletes or student athletes in general, to me, there's more to it than just wins and losses. How are they developing academically? How are they developing athletically? Those are probably the first, you know, the two that everyone thinks of, right, for student athletes. How about psychosocially? How about emotionally? How about, you know, relationships they have with teammates? How about the whole team building concept? All that stuff has to be measured, in my estimation, if you want to have a well-rounded person and an effective, really good team. So here's how I did it, and if you watched the video before this, there was talked about creating your library. A lot of these things I learned from the library that I created from the United States Olympic Training Centers and the symposiums that they had, and books that I purchased, and other media like motivational talks and whatnot. In other words, there are ways in which you can measure success that go beyond just the results of wins and losses. And I think you can measure success every single day. Athletes can measure their success every single day by keeping a journal. Now, a training log and or a journal is similar to a diary in as much as you're writing stuff down on a fairly consistent basis. And what I would do is if athletes didn't know how to create a training log or a journal, I would give them a template, and it had 4 or 5 things that they could, kind of track on a daily basis. Some of the things were, what kind of foods did you eat today? How much sleep did you get today? Etc. Things that they could kind of take a look at, because if you're not aware of them, sometimes you're not even, certain what you're actually doing. So tracking their success on a semi-daily basis, which means maybe they do it 3 or 4 times a week in their own little training log or journal. If they do that from, let's say, September through June, it's an 8 or 9 month span, now they can see their growth and development, and I tell you, that has a huge impact on their lives. As coaches, how can we do a periodic progress report prior to the competition and or event or the tournament? You can do the same thing with forms. Of course, the athletes got their own little form that they're keeping, training log, training journal. You can, one of those books I showed you was called Enhancing Recovery. Maybe go look at that video and check it out. It has a template in there where it asks specifically, it's a weekly one and then there's a 3 weekly one. Specifically, it has specific questions. It's asking them about, how is training going? How did you feel today? What was your energy level like? That's done on a weekly basis. So the idea behind that is you can kind of track the athlete's progress throughout the training design, throughout the mesocycle, or throughout the month on a weekly basis. And then another actual form that they had was called the rest queue. Again, we're talking about measuring success. That was like a 75 questionnaire type of document, and that it got real specific. That weekly one was called the rest queue, and the longer one was called the rest queue, or I can't think of it. There's a 6 or 7 question one that we did on a weekly basis, and that basically told them how they were doing, and they would answer it. How much sleep did you get? What did you eat today? How are you feeling in practice? What's your soreness level? Things like that. And the longer version was like 75 questions of something similar. That was called the rest queue. The recovery queue was the one that we did on a weekly basis. Every Monday I would give that to them, and then I would read it. I would take a look at it. More importantly, they would read it too. So it wasn't so much that I was getting all the information and selling it somewhere. I was trying to figure out if they could understand how their body was working, so that if they were fine-tuned, eating the right foods, getting the right amount of sleep, doing the right adequate amount of studying, they were primed for practice. And then, of course, when you feel good about yourself and you're primed for practice, you have better practices. On a monthly basis, we did the same thing with the rest queue. That was like 75 questions, and that took about 7 to 10 minutes to take. It went into the 3 to 5 minute range after they've done it 4 or 5 times. Again, talking about measuring success, now they can see all of the habits and their patterns they've had for the last month. Now, when you track that over the course of 5 or 6 months, the athletes can see their growth and development in the areas that they actually need to work on. Those are 2 examples of how you can measure success beyond just wins and losses. And again, once they kind of can get their lives organized in a systematic fashion, so they're getting the right amount of sleep, they can kind of tell where their emotions are at, they can keep their emotions in check, and those 2 forms kind of, they documented all that. Another way to measure success, if going back to one of those books called Periodization, I think that was actually the title of it, coaches can measure success by checking on the training plan. Okay, we are prescribed this amount of information for this amount of time. This is supposed to be a 90-minute practice with all of these things in there. Systematically, if you've got the plan written out for the whole year, you can kind of keep track of where you are just by, every so often looking back at your overall plan. Did we meet the goals and objectives that we set out for during this 3-week period? Well, how do you know if you don't have goals and objectives, number one, and if you haven't, created goals and objectives, that's probably a hint. If you have, now you take a look back at that plan. Now you can measure the success of your program based on the training design that you've created for the whole year, and then you break it down to per month, and then you break it down into week, and then you break it down into session. But all of that stuff is created prior to the whole season actually being created. So there are 3 different levels there of measuring success, or 4. The athlete keeps and tracks their own success with a journal, and they write down what they did each day and how they're feeling. Coaches track and test their success by giving them a weekly form, recovery queue, kind of ask them questions about what's going on with their life and how much sleep they're getting and what foods you're putting in. And the third one was similar to that last one, rest queue, 75-page questionnaire, 75 question. And it's a question, it's about 3 or 4 pages long. It takes about 5 or 6, 7 minutes to take. And that gives the athlete an idea of what's going on with their lives and why. And then the last one was the periodization plan, which encompasses all of that. So now you've got 3 or 4 different ways to measure the success of the program beyond just the wins and just the losses. The other thing that I did on a consistent basis was meet with the athletes every 3 weeks. So every 3 weeks, I would actually, individually meet with the athletes and ask them, what's going on with you? How's everything going? How are your grades going? What's bothering you? What are some things that you think we need to change in your training program? Then we would go through their goals, and they would specifically say, hey, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. So the meetings were to kind of get a sense of where they thought they were, where they thought they were going, to check on what their goals was and try to help them out in that area, and just to sit down and look in the athlete right in their eyes and say, hey, I care about you, I want you to succeed, how can I help you? Man, that goes a long way. Now you're not just dealing with the team, you're dealing with each athlete individually. So you can actually track and measure their success by, open eye contact, open mouth contact, building the relationship with the athlete becomes critical in that way. So now you've got 4 or 5 different ways that you can measure success. And if it's done on a consistent basis, you can understand the team way before you get to the tournament. The tournament ultimately is going to tell you what you did, won or loss wise. Prior to that, though, you can get progress reports and hints on how the team is feeling, how they're doing, etc. So there were 4 or 5 different ways. Initially, it's the training log or journal that the athlete keeps. And then the coach can implement that or assist that with weekly updates on basically how they're doing, what kind of foods they're eating, how much sleep they're getting, how they're feeling. And then every 3 to 4 weeks we did a longer version of that recovery cue. It was called the rest cue. It's like 75 questions, takes about 3 to 10 minutes to take. That gives them an overall picture of where they are. The periodization plan done by the coach again, that tracks the whole season and measures it in terms of here are our goals and objectives, did we meet them? And you can kind of take a look at that maybe once a week. And then the other example I gave was the individual coaching conversation. That's what I called them. I got that from I think he was a Norwegian ski coach. They implemented that, and they found out that they could find out a lot of information that the athlete wouldn't necessarily say in a group, or they wouldn't necessarily be forthcoming with it. But when you sit down and talk about it, man, athletes got a lot going on a lot of times. Man, they got to deal with their parents, they got to deal with their coach. If they're living in a dorm environment, they got to deal with the athletes, their teammates, other people that live in the dorms. They got to deal with their academics. And a lot of times those stressors can become unbalanced, and sometimes they just need an ear and they want to explain what's going on. So those are 4 or 5 different ways that I was able to measure success, and then the athletes kind of bought into it, and then it became a great thing. So the relationship was built on each side. The other way I think that we measure success beyond just wins and losses, because ultimately in the sporting athletic business at the collegiate and Olympic level, if your losses outweigh your wins, then there's a possibility that you can lose your job. The other side of it is if your relationships are suspect, meaning you don't have any good relationships at all, I don't care how much you're winning, you're probably going to lose your job. Here was the way that I completely and honestly, this was the way I measured it at the end of all of that. After 8 years working at the Olympic training centers, these meant a lot to me. And these are just letters and cards and whatnot from athletes. These are a complete measure of the success. I'm just going to read it to you. I won't give you the athlete's name because that would be nuts. Shannon, it's been quite the journey since arriving here. Of everyone I have encountered, I believe it is you I owe the most to. Now think about that. Here's a kid, an athlete, student athlete. This thing's like 4 pages long. She's writing that to me. In essence, the success of the program is measured by what the athletes think. Of course, the medals are nice, but when you get something like that, man, that means a whole lot. I have a whole lot of them over the years. This one was just given to me, and I'll just read it to you again. So, again, we're talking about measuring success beyond just wins and losses. Shannon, our time at Northern seemed to come to an abrupt end, and I didn't get a chance to really thank you for everything you've done for me. It's amazing how much personal growth I've done in just 3 years. And it goes on and describe, how she felt about the program and where she's going with the rest of her life. So for me, again, these are important. Just the cards and sentiments that the athletes will give you, along with all of the other things. Okay, we're talking about measuring success again. So I think there are a bunch of different ways that you can measure success, get progress, of course, beyond just the wins and losses. And if you explain that to the athletes, they will explain it back to you, and I think you can build a dynamic program, and in that way you will be able to measure your success. Remember, you can find out more information like this at Coach Shannon Talks on youtube.com, Coach Shannon.